Hello again, Ian. Good to be back with you.
Ah, yeah, very good. Good to see you.
Oh,
Um, I've been thinking about our last talk and a couple of things I just want to say coming out of it. One is that at the time we talked, I couldn't remember the name of the author of the paper about the technical philosopher. Um, and it is in fact William Earle, Earle, not a well-known figure, and it was written in the early 1960s, and the piece is entitled "Notes on the Death of a Culture," and I thought it was terrifically good, and I couldn't find it in print anywhere, so that's why I put it up on my website, and I think, very well worth going and reading if you want to um, get the current practice of philosophy into some sort of perspective. The other thing I thought was that I may have left people feeling a little baffled about what I said about subjective and objective, and I'm not quite sure. I mean, there are different places where we could bring that in, but I thought we might as well here actually. Um, the core of what I'm saying is relevant to a number of debates about consciousness and reality that are going on now. One very popular view is that we can never know reality, whatever exactly that means, because our knowledge is partial. Now, I agree that our knowledge is partial, but there are two quite distinct ways of thinking about this. One is that if you imagine that reality is somewhere out there, and we can only get so far towards it, so we can only go so many steps towards reality, and then we meet a wall. And whatever it is on the other side of this wall, and we can't really know it. In essence, this is a Kantian vision that we don't really know reality, we only know our projections on a sort of internal screen. I don't hold that and want to dissociate myself from that picture. But nonetheless, our knowledge is partial, but the partiality is of a quite different kind. It's that we know fully what we know, and it really is reality that we see, it's not something else. But it's only ever partial in the sense that we can only know a certain smallish part of all that is real. So it's not that the whole reality is there and we approach it, but we can't get any further. We can get all the way to genuine reality. That is what we are experiencing. It makes no sense to say that reality is something other than what it is that we experience, but it's just that that can never be a full, total understanding. For one thing, it comes from our standpoint, but all knowledge comes from a standpoint. That fact that it comes from a standpoint doesn't invalidate it. In fact, it couldn't possibly be knowledge unless it did come from a standpoint. So, but it's an important distinction to make. And I think an image that struck me was that of this wonderful Zen garden, I think in Kyoto, called Ryoanji, in which there are 15 rocks in the garden, but from any one place in it you can only see a maximum of 14. So that's a good image really to try and convey what it is that I'm saying.
yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, this is such an important claim and topic that belongs to any moment of our discussions, and so to do it right here at the beginning, I think it's very valuable. Let me ask you then, because I think I agree with you, and I don't buy this idea that because we obviously get a partial view of the world, and therefore, and that's what I don't agree, we don't get direct access to the world. So to me, the crucial issue is to discuss. I mean, it's not that I think I have it completely right. It's whether or to what extent we have really direct access. It's a question about perception. It's not even about
Yes.
consciousness. It's about what do we perceive really. And if we again buy, and I say buy consciously, and if we buy into the idea that we don't have direct perception onto anything, then we're sold the world as a copy rather than as an original.
Yes.
And then it's that's terrible. I mean, it's terrible conceptually, but also ethically, as we were discussing at the end of a previous session, how to live in a world where we are all convinced and have convinced ourselves that nothing of what we perceive is original, is an original, is always a surrogate.
Yes, of course, in a way, language is as so often, one of the difficulties here. I mean, what do we mean by what is real? It's one of those endless discussions, a rabbit hole down which one could disappear. But it seems to me I want to distinguish between, I completely agree with your formulation, but I want to distinguish between the right and left hemisphere views of reality. One of them actually is tentatively open to whatever there is, effectively, without a prejudgment. That's the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere gets information, if you like, at one remove. It's always dealing with its image or projection or diagram or map of the world, not with the world itself. And so it's natural when the left hemisphere reflects on the question of our experience and has to articulate something about it. It's natural that that articulation will contain this image that what we are experiencing is something like a film projected on a screen. People talk about a dashboard in which we read off certain things on this internal dashboard. But I believe that when we taste pineapple, what we taste is in fact pineapple, and that taste is the taste of pineapple. And to say that it isn't, or it's just a projection or an image of something, is, in my view, mistaken. But of course we all know, see, experience, perceive things slightly differently. And once again, one needs to not go off to either extreme. Everyone's perceptions, everyone's understanding of the world will be somewhat different, but it will also be remarkably similar. So in general, we can talk to other people about their experience and expect there to be commonalities, and indeed there obviously are. But that is also compatible with the idea that each of us has and cannot help having our own take on it. But as you say, that take is a real take of part of reality. It's not something made up by us alone. It is something that comes out of an encounter, and the encounter is really with whatever that other thing is. Yeah. I just wanted to say that because the subject that we're talking about today, I think, is reasons, what a chapter I call Reason's Progeny. And what I mean by that are certain elements that form a dipole, and I mention about 5 of them in this chapter, which are, in which reason has to accommodate a bit of both. And as usual, one of them is much more clearly the right hemisphere's take, and the other more clearly the left. And that although we need both, we need the right hemisphere's take to be the overall take, to be illuminated by what the left hemisphere can contribute, not to ignore the right hemisphere's contribution and look only at the left hemisphere. So there are, if you like, pairs of terrible twins that are involved, and one of them might be the subjective versus objective, which I don't actually deal with in this chapter, but that's what I've just been talking about. That would be an example of terrible twins, except that how the thing should really be set up is the left hemisphere's idea that there is subjective and there is objective, versus the right hemisphere's idea that dichotomy in itself is part of the error. Yeah. So there we are.
Well, very helpful image of the dipole, actually. I mean, we could start with that because I think it's, I would ask you to elaborate a little because I think it's very, very helpful again, because you're not talking about dualisms here or even dualities. You're talking about dipole, which to me conveys this idea that there can be many, but they're still within one, right? So despite talking about two, there's a sense of integration that the dipole offers.
Yes, the dipole offers various things, and one is, as you say, that it's able to suggest that there are two importantly distinguishable elements, but that we don't have to put them together. We don't have to combine two things that are effectively separate. They are two aspects of one indissoluble thing. And this is where apologies because I've used it before, but it's the best image I know, come back to the idea of a bar magnet. I mean, which very importantly, the North and South Pole are quite distinct, and yet we don't have to put a North Pole and a South Pole together to make a magnet. In our minds, we separate them as though they are completely distinct, and yet the magnet is the coming together or not even the coming together, because that suggests that they antecedently were separate, but is the ability to see a whole which is differentiable within that whole without it disintegrating through the process of differentiation.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, let's think of some examples. I mean, one of the first things I look at, and this makes clear, I hope, what it is I'm talking about, is the pair abstraction versus embodiment. Some ways in which we can think about the world and solve problems do involve a sort of algebraic taking of things out of their context so that we can manipulate them or think about their relationships alone without thinking about the way in which they are embodied in the texture of a lived human life. And yet there is also, very importantly, a kind of reason that takes into account all the rest, the context, which includes the context of being part of a living human body, and the implicit and so on that we've discussed. I don't think you need to go back over that. So both of those tendencies are helpful. And the abstraction is more like the rationality of the left hemisphere's approach, and the embodiment is more part of the reason that is the right hemisphere's approach. So what matters here is that when we have used the process of abstraction, we need to take whatever information that has yielded to us back into that overall context. And there are a number of problems that occur. One is that by doing the process of abstraction, we in some ways take away from the directness or the value of perception and see the theory based on our perceptions and experience as being more real, so that the map becomes more important than the territory. And another is the loss of two things together: the sense of something as unique, because all existing things are in the end unique, however much we may be able to find ways of classifying them into categories, and the loss of context. And this leads to what William James called vicious abstractionism, whereby the process of thinking and philosophizing takes whatever it is that we're actually trying to illuminate into a very special realm where it is disembodied, abstract, and decontextualized.
Yes, this evokes to me, I like to think of abstraction as also a kind of subtraction, which is like you have something and you decide you're going to remove parts from it in order to do a certain manipulation, which again, we're validating it. It's very important and very useful. I think I understand that. What perhaps you could help me with is the second part of this kind of alchemic process or distillation process, which is, sure, we have the concrete unique thing or unique things, then processes, we understand, right? Unique things. And then we distill, subtract, abstract, and then we do whatever we need to do. But then what about the second part? Like there's a takeoff. It seems quite an impossible thing to do, like to ground it back. When you talk about embodiment, to me, it also means this idea of back to earth, back to the concrete real world. How is it possible to then land this plane of abstractions onto a real
I like your use
ground? Yeah.
I like your use of the plane metaphor, which is quite possibly prompted by that quote from Whitehead I use in this chapter, where he talks about thinking as being like a plane that takes off with a certain cargo, goes out into the higher atmosphere and then lands again and has another look at reality and then goes. So it's this back and forth between the realm of abstraction and embodiment. Ultimately, I don't think one can start from abstraction. Well, in a way, how could you? Because abstraction itself means the dragging away or the drawing away of something from its context. So you can't begin with abstraction and then hope to achieve an understanding of the whole. This is like a very important point made by Bergson, where he says that from intuition we can move on to analysis, but from analysis we can never move on to intuition. So once again, the right hemisphere's faculty can incorporate the left hemisphere's faculty without losing something, but the left hemisphere's faculty doesn't have what it is available to it that the right hemisphere knows. So yes, I think one of the things that I would see happening again in modern thinking is a tendency towards too great abstraction, an obsession with form at the expense of content, actually.
Yes. I mean, Bergson also says that speaking about nothingness comes after speaking about something, like there's existence, and then we wonder what it will be, but we start from existence. So this is already another trick where philosophers can spend pages and pages, but if we reverse the order, as you did at the very, I will always remember, I think it's the introduction, right, of the book, where you make this list of all these inversions of terms, order and nothingness and virtual and so on, and it's very helpful again. But still, maybe the last point you made about form over content can help me understand how to land the plane, because in a way we all know we are all taught more or less how to take off, you know, because we are taught maths and we're taught language, and we more or less, we don't need to be like sophisticated philosophers, we more or less live comfortably well in a world of abstractions that gets us going in life. How do we land this plane to concrete experience? I guess perhaps part of the solution is practices that are literally embodied, you know, but how to do that in philosophy, how to do that in these discussions we're having about science and philosophy?
Well, the very fact we have to ask the question is part of this problem alluded to and which alerts us, made by William Earle about the technicalization of philosophy. I would say that in the last 70 years, we've moved from a situation where scientists and philosophers would have to be quite widely educated up to the time that they certainly left school, and they would have been given a context, nothing less than the history of their culture, the philosophy, the literature, and so on. But increasingly that is not happening. And so we have a lot of people who've been trained technically but don't really have any sense of the broader context, which makes the whole business of what they're doing in science and philosophy worth doing at all. If you neglect that broader context, then why are we really doing either of these things? It's again that point made by Schrödinger, that all of science is worth little if it doesn't help us in some way to answer the question, who are we?
Let me just push a bit more the plane analogy, and then we move on to the other, the other terrible twins. As you're saying this, I'm imagining myself literally flying it. And so what happens if you don't know how to land, or, and this is the other metaphor, you haven't been taught to recognize the land that you see beneath you, which in my view will be the humanities, right? Like you're flying, you don't know how to land, and you look down there, and it's like I cannot recognize those mountains, those rivers. I mean, I'm totally ignorant about those. Now you may then decide, well, like maybe the left hemisphere kicks in and says, well, I don't want to land anyway. Like who was speaking about landing? But the fuel will finally we will run out of fuel. So what's going to happen? We're going to crash. And I think we've seen so many crashes. I mean, the plane is going to crash somewhere, and then maybe the left hemisphere.
Yes.
Well, that's anyways when I wanted to land, but it's like, I think Owen Barfield makes this phrase like pretending that drowning is a style of swimming, right? It's like, well, pretending that crash is a style of landing. Well, it's funny and terrible at the same time. Well, that's as far as the metaphor goes.
Yes, I think one way of thinking about that is that in philosophizing one needs to be constantly going back to the concreteness of real lived experience. And that's something that I think, again, happens too little. That we can get so in love with our schema, our theory about how the world should be, that we stop going back and saying, but is that really how the world is? And is that what we encounter in it? So very important to be able to do that process of landing. And William James has so often has something lovely to say. I can't remember how exactly he goes, but he talks about a balloon flight in which one takes off into the airy upper atmosphere and one sees wonderful sights, and this is terribly, terribly valuable. But unless it's able to land again, what will happen is it will go out in a burst of flame, and the balloon will catch fire, and that's it. It'll get too close to the stars, we won't know anything. So good philosophy is always doing this to and fro between the realm of abstraction and the realm of the concrete embodied. And it's just another example of this moving backwards and forwards, which is just essential to all the things we're discussing, between things that we think of as opposed, but they need to be held together, not in a perfect symmetry. That's the other thing, but in an asymmetrical relationship in which the one that is most to be prized is the right hemisphere's view, but it can be wonderfully illuminated by, added to and enriched by what the left hemisphere gives.
A pole that it's dynamic. Yes, a dynamic pole.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and that might take us on to another pair that I mentioned. I think we've probably talked a little about this already, but anyway, the distinction between precision and accuracy. And I'm sure I've made the point about the derivation of these, but I like it. So precision actually comes from the Latin root pre-kisos, being cut off too early, too soon. And accuracy comes from the words in Latin ad, towards, and curare, to care. So it exhibits care towards something. That's accuracy, whereas precision is cutting it off before one should have done so. And that piece of etymology illuminates, I think, what's important here in the distinctions. So once again, I think we talked about this last time, one can attempt to over-clarify something, to over-precisify it. I don't think we have this word in English, but I was delighted to discover that in French one can say précisifier. Anyway, we can over-precisely define or delimit something in the struggle for a certain kind of clarity. But in doing so, we lose its meaning and we become too rigid.
Interesting too. When you talk about you said cut off too soon, so you didn't say cut off at all, which is very interesting, because if we think in terms of gardening, it's not that cutting off is bad, it's that everything has its own timing. If you think in terms of a garden, right? Well, probably you need to cut off these leaves or these branches. The question is when you do it. So it's maybe this is an example of something that leads us back to a more contextual and embodied like realm, because you need to ask, well, at what time should I do that? It's not a universal formula.
Exactly.
So you evoke this to me by going again over the etymology of cut off too soon.
Yes, I hadn't thought of that, so that's a very nice point, that actually one still does need, if one's a good gardener, to encourage growth by actually clarifying what's happening by taking little parts out so that the whole may flourish better. So it's not, again, that I've any problem with the critical faculty. I think it's extraordinarily important, and reason is a very big part of that. But it's just that by cutting off, you can't make a plant. Cutting off is something that a healthy plant can benefit from if done in moderation at the right time, in the right circumstances.
Yes,
So,
yes. And
yes,
all these
that's
caveats
good.
annoy those that want a very clear cut
Yes, yeah.
protocol. But you need to sense
Yes.
when's the right time, the right moment, the right plant, the right place to do it. Yes. This
Well, I think that
yes, to rigor and ambiguity, which is related to this, and you mentioned the rigor of ambiguity.
yes, it's a lovely phrase, and I think is it from Nora Bateson? Or I can't remember, but it probably isn't. But anyway, I liked it very much, that there is a sort of proper rigor of ambiguity in which a situation which is intrinsically ambiguous, ambivalent, or appears to have opposite qualities, in order to be true to that, to exhibit proper care, to be accurate, you should take care not to destroy that ambiguity, in fact to illuminate that ambiguity as at the center of what it is one's looking at. So because sometimes people think, oh well, unless you're clear, you're just being a sloppy thinker. Well, actually there's a kind of sloppy thinking which is being too accurate. And again, Friedrich Weismann, who was a pupil of Wittgenstein's, and as I say, the reader in logic at Oxford, he says himself that there is he's always thought that the need to over-clarify was the refuge of people who had nothing really to say, and that being able to allow some of the obscurity of what one's looking at to be present is a very important part of philosophy.
A demolishing quote.
Yeah. And of course, another thing about cutting off is that you have to be careful not to lose the sense of the whole. There's a phrase we have which is getting the gist of something, and again it's a rather important one because it's slightly imprecise. When you get the gist of a matter, what it means is you have a broad understanding of it, a wise, commonsensical, experienced ability to see what's going on, which may not be easy to put into language. And that demands seeing things together. So it's always based on a more global appreciation of what's going on. So once again, when one's engaged in the perfectly satisfactory business of analysis, up to a point satisfactory, one must remember that what one is doing is only in the service of seeing the whole again as something richer now, after the process of analysis has been carried out.
Yes. And everyday language express it very easily when you say, I get it, You say, well, I get it.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That can mean so many things, but yeah, you're right. There is a sense in which language is always, of course, approximate. It's fascinating that people, certain kinds of philosophers particularly, think that you can't really have understood what you're saying until you can put it clearly into words.
Yes.
But if everything that exists is in fact individual and contextualized, words are always going to be only very approximate. So that when people are striving for what they think of as precision, they are advising a process which inevitably involves approximation. There couldn't be a word for everything that exists because the vocabulary would be the same size as the experienced world. I mean, for example, colors. We wouldn't be able to get by if every single color that we can discriminate, the hundreds of thousands or even millions of colors, we couldn't have a word for each of them. That might sound like it's a benefit, but it would, of course, make us less able to express ourselves. So when we're talking, we're always making generalizations and broad approximations. Nothing wrong with that, but one shouldn't think that those broad approximations and so on are the end of the story. One needs always to be able to go beyond them. Sorry, Alex, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was interrupting you. I was going to say, this brings me back to your remarks at the beginning of this discussion, because words as approximation reminds me of perception as partial, nevertheless direct. So something I'm missing in the use of words we find everywhere. They look to me as if they're not really alive. Like the use of language as this kind of passive exercise. And I'd like to see the words as kind of these living things that are telling things to us, and also we're in dialogue. And as you were mentioning, the demand for clarity, like I to pretend I don't get it unless you say it clearly, sounds like this passive attitude of, well, I'm not going to engage, but also the words, I'm not going to think that the words are engaging either. I know it sounds a bit animist, um, kind of. Oh, but
No,
there should be some
you're,
living
you're
aspect
right.
of words, and they're kind of zombies. That's what I want
Yes,
to say. In
yes,
thinking, in talking, it's like
yes,
zombie
yes.
words across zombie people.
Yes. I mean, of course, before I say anything more, I want to emphasize that I'm sure we would agree with me about this, that it is not a waste of time to attempt to articulate things in language. In fact, we must do so. But we must do so in full knowledge that what we get at the end of this is not the truth. It's something that may or may not illuminate a living entity. And I like your emphasis on living, because intuitively, analysis seems to be a process of killing something. As Wordsworth said, we murder to dissect. And yes, again, the philosopher Jan Zwicky has a rather nice image about analytic philosophy, that, as it were, it pares away the flesh from the bone until all the philosopher can exhibit is his glass case full of polished bone. But somehow the notion that the patient actually is no longer there seems to have escaped everyone's attention. So I think you're absolutely right that this left hemisphere cast of mind, I've explained before that literally the left hemisphere is not good at understanding the animate. It tends to approximate everything to the inanimate, to the mechanical, to the utilizable, whereas the right hemisphere tends in the opposite direction to see things as instinct with life. So in approaching a living problem, which if we're not approaching a living problem, then what are we doing as philosophers? We need to be careful to use, it's like using a certain kind of acid that can be very helpful. It can even help cure something. But of course you don't want to spread it everywhere and destroy what you're doing. There are in medicine an awful lot of things that you need, and they're a poison actually, but giving a little bit of them is incredibly helpful. So for example, digoxin, which has been used since the 18th century actually, is distilled from foxglove leaves, is extremely poisonous. Foxglove leaves are highly poisonous if you eat them. But a very important medicine for heart failure, digoxin, is derived from them. So being able to use a little of something as a clarifier, as a healing process is great. But once you rely only on this aggressive dissolution of what you have in front of you, then you end up with something dead. You have anatomized it, cut it up.
Yes. Yes, and perhaps this brings us to another. I love that you said terrible twins, another dipole, another reason's progeny, which is calculation and judgment, right?
Yes, yes.
And the
Yes.
use of numbers, making them into idols in a way, because we don't trust language, then we'll rely on numbers, and then we'll think the numbers are going to give us everything we need.
Yes, yes. Numbers are interesting in themselves because many numbers have special qualities. All the lower numbers, up to about 12 certainly, have very particular qualities. They're found in nature in different ways. They give rise to different shapes. So there are rectangular structures, there are pentagonal structures, there are hexagonal structures in nature. The difference between a dyad and a triad, all these things, and there are some other numbers that are much greater, like 329, which have particular meaning to mathematicians. But what I'm really getting at is that these numbers have qualities. So although we think of a number as just quantity, these numbers actually bring with them something of quality, and that is not directly related, but it's worth mentioning in connection with this, that quantity always changes quality. This is again something we don't seem to understand. Yeah. We look at something as quantifiable and we think it's good, and therefore to have much more of it would be much better than the amount we've now got. But we forget that whatever this is part of a dipole. It carries with it its perhaps currently hidden or inexpressed opposite, and that if we keep increasing the amount, we may change the quality into the opposite.
Yes.
So that, for example, too much liberty can lead to tyranny.
Yeah. I mean, I'm baffled by this because, as we were saying in the previous chapter, there's some axioms that we take so much for granted. That's the point of them. Then the moment you just suggest, well, why don't you try this other one? Then, well, there's this sense of impossibility and also of the new. Like, I see now, I can't conceive these two opposites together and realize that having too much of one at the expense of the other defeats both of them.
Yes. Which makes a nice point that what comes out of the proper balance is not some halfway house. I'm constantly trying to express this idea that what I'm talking about is not just a position of mediocrity in which nothing very much gets expressed, but really the opposite, in which each of the two things that we're balancing and trying to bring into harmony is fully expressed, but expressed together with its counterpart. Yes. And that is like the Heraclitean image of the tension in the string of the bow, the tension in the string of the lyre, that gives rise to the arrow, the musical note, and so forth.
Yes.
So yeah.
I was going to say, isn't time? You go.
No, go on. Okay. What I was just going to say is, what we forget also is that numbers are relations.
Sorry?
So we tend to think of numbers as sort of an absolute thing, even if an abstract thing, but they all describe actually a relation. And what we're looking at is the relations between things, which we need numbers to be able to express. And it's most obvious in the case of a fraction. So a half we write as 1/2, and what that means is a relationship between a 1 and a 2 at the same time, which gives rise to the half, which is different from either the 1 or the 2. So something new and relational comes out. So in the right hemisphere, numbers can be seen as dynamic with their own qualities, whereas in the left hemisphere they seem to be absolute, abstract, and adynamic.
Yeah. Homogeneous and without taste. I
yes.
Step back one step, because it's such an important point, the one you were making about quantification having qualities, but also the reverse, that when we're trying to quantify something that's quality-like, there's something lost there. And it took me a long time to understand. I'm not claiming I'm fully grasping it, but when, for instance, Bergson or any thinker that's holistic and processual says, well, you cannot reduce this. If you study life like this, if you mechanize it, you cannot do that. Or if you quantify it in these ways, you cannot. And I always thought, well, I think I agree, but in any case, you can, because people do it. But it's not that people do it, it's that I think the sentence needs to be finalized. It's you cannot do it without the thing you're studying changing its quality. And once I got that, it's like, now I understand. So sure, you can do it, but now you'll be studying a different thing. If you're fine with this, or everybody's fine. But let's not forget this ending of the sentence.
Yes. Very important for modern life, because so often we see attempts to quantify something, and whatever that thing is, utterly travestied by this process of quantification. Yes. So quantifying the arts, quantifying education. All these things destroy the nature of what they're doing. And there are a couple of examples that spring to my mind. One was a 300-page report on a projected development in an area of outstanding natural beauty, in which all kinds of things were assessed about the impact on the local economy and all this sort of thing that could be measured in figures, or at least people could project what they thought were possible figures, likely figures to turn up in if we went down this path. And on the last page they say, of course, this development would have an impact on the beauty and the magnificence of this wild landscape, but we cannot quantify it, and so we do not take it into account. And even better, because it's just so utterly astounding in its clarity of what it's about, is a report by the WHO, the World Health Organization, on the effects of a program, a very successful program for the inhibition and if possible, abolition of onchocerciasis, a parasitic condition that is endemic in parts of Africa and it's a river-borne infection, and so children and adults who go into the water can get this, and it renders them blind. And they evaluated the success of the program on the basis of various economic metrics, and actually say that, of course, the program will have had a beneficial effect on the lives of people who would otherwise have been blind. But since they don't contribute to the economy, there's no way to give this a figure, so we've left it out. Now, I mean, if you really want to see the thing at its most brilliantly obvious, then that's one of the best examples.
Yes, and you're right, which is a strong claim that this kind of moral calculus is inhuman and immoral, right?
It is, because in lots of ways, first of all, it helps us destroy the nature of things that are very important, like education, like healthcare, and like the arts, by pretending that our metrics are the important measures. But in proportion to the importance of what we're looking at, is the difficulty of actually reducing it to a metric. There's a very nice book by a man called, I think, Geoffrey Muller, called The Tyranny of Metrics, which I do recommend. It's very readable, and it really talks about this whole problem. But the immorality of it is particularly relevant because a kind of computational utilitarian ethic is what is espoused by philosophers in moral philosophy in Anglophone universities. And perhaps in chapter 26, I think it is, where we will talk about values, we can say more about that. But there's a sense in which trying to solve a moral problem by a kind of calculus is in itself an immoral way to approach a situation.
Let me add one more thing before we move to another of these twins, which comes to mind now, again, because we're talking, so thank you. It's like this immoral act, it's not just that you don't honor the nature of the thing you're studying. It's not just that you're not, if you will, reading its precise nature. It's precise, no, it's accurate. It's accurate nature. If you're not reading it well, it's like by doing that, there's a selection force that will morph that very thing often into a monster. So it's more dangerous than just, well, you're not valuing the thing as it deserves. It's by doing that, you'll set up all these forces that will steer people and actions into a direction that's going to turn that very thing often into a worse situation.
Yes, and have at the same time a deleterious impact on the person. To encourage this calculative idea of morality is itself a terrible thing to do to human beings. So anyway, I think we will return to that one much later when we talk about values, because I think it's very important.
Mm-hmm.
And before we leave that, I just wanted to comment that like all these terrible twins, calculation has its uses. It's not that I'm saying we should abandon being able to calculate. It's just knowing how and how far and how much, and in what way and in what context to use our calculative faculty. And incidentally, both hemispheres contribute to calculation. Certain kinds of calculation, especially those that use multiplication, probably because they involve reciting what we've internalized as children, which we call our times tables, which are the results of certain kinds of multiplication. That is very much dependent on the left hemisphere. But it's an interesting point that while the left hemisphere can produce more accurate calculation faster, usually, than the right hemisphere, the right hemisphere, I should say more precise actually, the right hemisphere has a more accurate idea of what's going on, because although its results are more imprecise, they are more in touch with the nature of things. So that won't be clear. What I mean here is, for example, if you do calculations, for example, doing your tax return or something like that, you can add up sums using a calculator. But I always think it's very important to have a look at it from one's own thinking point of view and see what the likely figure here is, and then sum it in my head, because as it were, the purely calculative can come up with an answer and then you blindly include it. But actually the thinking mind, the right hemisphere, as it were, is going to say, hey, that's the wrong kind of an answer here. That's really the difference. And it's the same thing that I've said before, that the left hemisphere is a very useful processor as long as the process that's being asked for, the procedure, is familiar. It can do it very quickly. But what that actually means at the end of the day, the right hemisphere understands more about its meaning in the real context out of which that calculation stemmed than the left hemisphere is able. Good.
Yeah, just the same physics, one can calculate to the 10th decimal point, but also then one has a sense for these, what's called the order of magnitude, which is, well, it doesn't matter if it's 8 or 7, what matters if it's in the order of tens, hundreds or thousands, and you have a sense of well, it could be you're calculating whatever about a star, or it could be anything, but you usually have a sense for that, and so you'll compare the precise calculation, the accurate calculation, with this order of magnitude, and that's so valuable. Actually, that's how the energy of, I think, what was it, the first atomic bomb was estimated, and that's a word I like. It was estimated by these pictures on the cover, and you could get the order of magnitude of the whole energy there. That wasn't really a calculation, it was an estimation, and that gave much more information. I mean, you didn't want to have the decimals, you wanted to have an order of magnitude. That was important.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, like that very much.
Okay, next one.
Okay, and is that linearity versus the Gestalt? Well, this constantly comes up, this idea of what could be seen as a chain or a line of instructions, and the idea of a shape that gradually becomes clearer as it comes more into focus. And again, we at times need linear processes, but once again they need to be contributing to what is ultimately the appreciation of a form, a shape, a Gestalt. So what we need to bear in mind also is that linearity has this air of being the single answer. So there's this chain that we follow, and as long as we follow it accurately or precisely, we will then come to a conclusion which is irrefutable. But as we talked about in our last session, reasoning is not like this. It doesn't lead to a solution that can be compelled on anybody who follows it. And no argument is final, and it is often presented in a certain way that hides from us the fact that there are a number of strands here that need to be taken into account. The tendency is, when talking in linear terms, to think of one line of argument as being decisive, whereas, as C.S. Peirce said, we should think of logic as woven together, a rope of many strands. So there are many things that need to be taken into account, even in our logical attempt to come to a truth. Don't forget that Peirce was a mathematician and a logician. Yeah.
I like this double quality of not a single strand, but many, and not
Yes.
many or one that reach to a final destination, but more like an ongoing. So it's another challenging idea that conclusions are never conclusive.
Yes.
And in a way, like life, as we were talking about words as being alive, well, it reminds me of life, which is always ongoing, like a kind of an infinite game, you see?
Yes, absolutely.
Thinking is always ongoing. It's not that, okay, we reach there and then we stop, because that would be like the end of thinking. It would be like death.
Yes. And if we are always coming back, touching down on the runway and having a look at the real world in between times, we won't fall into this problem that happens when people stop setting their argument in the context of the actual experience of living a life, which is very obvious in the case of moral judgment. Moral judgments are never single-stranded. They need to bring together many strands that alert us to different things that are at stake here in trying to arrive at a moral decision.
Yes, and maybe back to judgment, but since you mentioned it, as I was reading your chapter, I was thinking about juries and judges, and very soon you speak about that explicitly, and what's a good judge, right? And how to weight a decision. And you consider multiple lines, but if you don't have an algorithm, and at the end of the day, you also need to be contextual, which can sound to some people like not being so fair, not applying justice so well, but there's something, again, paradoxical about justice based also on previous history and context. As in biology, where we insist on the importance of context and historicity, it's like, well, but we don't really want to do that. Well, you need to do it, because otherwise, how are you going to be a good judge if you don't?
Yes, that's a good point. I mean, there's a tendency, isn't there, now to think that we can operationalize what it is a judge does, and that by doing so, we will take, personal variation out of the judgments that judges reach. But you can't have everything, and if you do that, then you make the judgment much cruder and less flexible than it should be, taking into account the full human situation, which can be never specified in an algorithm or a book of rules. So I think of this as like what happens in healthcare in this country. In the old days, healthcare, national healthcare, was very much dictated from Whitehall, from the centre of government. And then people said, but it doesn't really reflect differences on the ground in different communities, different parts of the country. People should be allowed to have more input to what is needed where they are. But then, as soon as that started to become the case, people realized there was a new problem, which is what they call a postcode lottery, which means that if you live in a certain place, you can have access to a certain thing that was thought by somebody local to be very important there. But if you live in another place, you won't have access to it, or not so readily. And you can't have it both ways. I mean, if you want human judges, then you have to celebrate and accept the fact that within a range, I mean, obviously if somebody is making profoundly eccentric and injudicious judgments, then they need to be removed from their position. But generally speaking, when the system is functioning properly, the judgments made by judges will be different on different occasions. That is what one is hoping for.
Yeah, very good. Now the other anecdotes. Sorry, you put some examples that immediately grounds us to everyday life. Well, you have this one of the two friends having coffee, and previously you also had that one about come on and stay, bring your toothbrush, and maybe I should be more accurate and tell them, well, also bring your pajama and so on. I mean, they look like jokes, but I think helps the reader. At least they help me to make this into a humor. phase where it can be actually understood better. So the two one
Yes, yeah, yes, I mean that's yeah, just a reference to the fact that certainly in English anyway, it's quite a common phrase to say to somebody who's coming to supper, bring your toothbrush, which means you can stay the night. But as soon as you start expanding this and being more precise, it becomes much worse if you have to say, well, bring a toothbrush and some toothpaste. It seems like you're sort of making a point about their bad breath, and then today, but now you're compelled to mention pajamas, so the whole thing becomes endless. And you'd think that law would be better when it's very precise, but I give examples of why it absolutely isn't. That the more you have to specify, the more somebody can assume that if it's not actually specified in this very long text, which, by the way, they will never have time to read, then it's legal. In other words, it's the funeral of common sense.
Yes, yeah.
Anyway, yeah, there we go. The thing about the friends having coffee, though, is worth describing, because it brings up it illuminates that thing I was talking about, of the difference between a disembodied calculation and what the right hemisphere sees, which is not a disembodied calculation, but something about what was going on in the minds of the people in the situation. So it's an easy scenario to describe, and it's the basis of a piece of research by two American neuroscientists who had decided that they wanted to examine the role of the right hemisphere in moral decision making, and they asked people to give a judgment on which was the more immoral of two narratives. They're both about two friends having coffee, and in the first case, one friend thinks what she thinks is sugar. She puts what she thinks is sugar into her friend's coffee, but in fact it's poison, and the friend dies. In the other scenario, she puts what she thinks is poison into her friend's coffee, but in fact it's sugar, and the friend lives. Which was the more immoral? Now, when the brain is intact, of course we say the more immoral was when the person put the sugar in the coffee thinking it was poison, and the patient lived. But when the right temporoparietal junction is suppressed, people start saying things that only people with brain damage do, that it's all to be judged by the outcome. So the case that was immoral was where the friend died. Never mind what was going on in the mind of the agent. And this is a problem for all modern utilitarianism in philosophy, which we'll no doubt again come back to. But yeah.
So another illustration of missing the Gestalt of the situation.
Yes, that's right. Yes, yes.
Should we talk about this emphasis you put on philosophy and philosophers as bearing their stamp on what they write and what they say? I found that's also very, one doesn't hear it enough often, like that we really have our personalities and temperaments, and so one must have the person who proposed the thought included in the understanding of what's being tried to say.
Yes, it's a point again that keeps recurring, which is that although the rhetoric of certain things like science and academic philosophy seems to suggest that the personality of the person that's writing is irrelevant and doesn't take part, nonetheless it does take part, and it's much safer to notice that it does. So there is this pair of terrible twins, the impersonal versus the personal. And of course, there is some value in not allowing one's own very obvious characteristic biases to affect one's judgment so that one reaches a false conclusion. That's obvious. But the pretense that, in fact, philosophy can be done from a standpoint of what Thomas Nagel calls the view from nowhere is to deceive oneself, because all philosophy is, to some extent, an expression of the character and the personality of the person philosophizing. And not only that, but I point out that is the expression of a particular kind of personality which lies somewhere on the schizo-autistic spectrum. So whether or not the individuals who embark on academic courses of philosophy already have this tendency in them, it's magnified at any rate by the course. And I think it's a combination of the two, that people with underlying schizo-autistic traits are more attracted to philosophy, and that the kind of philosophizing they're trained in can exacerbate that and precipitate a problem. Two things I could mention about that are relevant. One is that I did a study which I never got round to publishing when I was a registrar at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, where we have records, very detailed records of many people with all forms of mental illness, and quite a lot of them had embarked on university degrees, and I just wanted to see what correlation there was between the pathology that they exhibited and the degree courses they'd signed up for. And in the case of schizophrenia, much the commonest course that was signed up for was engineering, but it was quite closely followed by philosophy. Whereas in the case of people who had if you like, more humanly understandable conditions of affect, like depression or bipolar disorder, tended to be studying degree courses in the humanities, such as literature and language and so on. So that alerted me to the fact that there was a problem there. And then when I was practicing, I had a patient who was a philosopher, and he made a very interesting point. He was rather obsessional. In fact, he had obsessive compulsive disorder, and he noticed that this was fairly well under control as long as he was studying the European phenomenological philosophers, whose philosophy accepts that precision is not something that can actually ever be achieved. But he became quite ill when he was studying Anglo-American analytic philosophy with its demand for precision and analysis. So I thought that was just another strand of information that illuminates what
with this piece of data we make 10 more friends, Ian. Well, I was going to ask you actually about how do you think this study of yours would replicate in space and in time. So in time, I would ask about it having in the 19th or 18th or maybe 3rd century. So you think you mentioned it's the West, but it's the recent West. And also in space, what about the East, which I know virtually nothing about? What about the kind of philosophies and traditions that we have in the East? And of course, you've touched on this in the Master and his Hemisphere, in this kind of history of ideas and so on. And I know you located particularly into Western modernity, right? But it's useful, at least to me, to zoom out in space and time and see how you think that would hold or not.
Yes, well, at the end of the Master and his Emissary, I do talk a little bit about the differences between the results of studies in Western subjects and Far Eastern subjects. And there are some interesting ones there. What they don't, on the whole, exemplify or corroborate is the idea that in the West we've enormously left hemisphered, and in the right they're enormously right hemisphered. What it in fact demonstrates is that yes, in the left we are enormously left hemisphered in our approach to life, but that in the East they have, until recently anyway, been very much more balanced. So it's not West, left, East, right. It's West, left, East, a nice balance. No, actually at the moment, as the Far East, certainly in the last 20, 30 years, has particularly espoused Western ways of approaching and thinking, I would imagine that something like this would now, unfortunately, be found pretty much across the globe. The tyranny of Western ways of looking at things and thinking about things. But I think if we go back in the past, it wouldn't necessarily have been the case at all, because philosophy was a different business. It was much more like that business of the love of wisdom.
Yes.
But interestingly, I do look back at Western philosophers since the Enlightenment, and it's from the Enlightenment onwards that one begins to see this. Descartes himself had quite strong schizotypal qualities, and Kant was probably autistic. And you know, we know from their lives that their obsessions with certain disembodied, abstract, analytic ways of thinking, which were part of their personal characteristics, became expressed in their philosophy. And it goes forward. I mean, it's a rather invidious thing to do, to point to philosophical cases, as it were, and retrospectively diagnose them, and it can't always be accurate, of course. I'm careful to say that. But nonetheless, there is a striking tendency within the analytic tradition to find characters who have a kind of excessively analytic way of thinking associated with the schizo-autistic spectrum to be attracted to philosophy as a career.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's valuable, as we were saying before, in considering all these threads, to also entertain the history of philosophy and the personality or the psychology of philosophers.
Yes.
Why not? It's
Yes.
one more
Yes.
thread that help us reach
Yes.
a conclusion,
Yes.
quote unquote. Yeah, yeah.
Indeed, indeed.
Okay,
I mean, and actually thinking about philosophers, you know, was Montaigne a philosopher? Was Erasmus a philosopher? They weren't in the modern technical sense, but I would say they were, very much so. And they exemplify this highly embodied, contextualized way of thinking in which opposites can be shown to be true in different contexts. It comes back to Whitehead's famous remark, or at least famous in my mind, or should be famous, remark that when we're talking about a scientific truth or a philosophical truth, we shouldn't ask, is this just blankly true or false, but in what circumstances can it be said to be true, and in what circumstances could it be said to be false?
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. So I think this is a good segue to talk about one more and very important terrible twin, which is mythos and logos.
Yes. Well, yes. One of the things that struck me was again to do with going back into the history of words. Mythos and logos are both ancient Greek words. Muthos, as it would have been, was considered to be the more important kind of understanding, more important than logos. And it was a kind of really imaginative understanding which could be expressed in myths and narratives, what we now call myths and narratives. And logos was less to be trusted, and I think one can see some reason why. If one thinks about the great myths that were instinctively turned to by people like Freud and Jung in trying to illuminate the human condition, they have enduring meaning and enduring reality across time and space, whereas, as I've said before, the outcomes of logical discussions are famously not agreed by people. They tend to lead to argument. You know, in other words, they can be not demonstrated to reach a final kind of truth. But in any case, as time has gone on, apparently myth only came into the English language in the 19th century. I was astonished. But almost as soon as it began, it had this air of not being true, which in Greek it didn't have at all. It had of seeing a higher truth. And logos started to become more important with Plato and Aristotle. And mythos, despite the fact that Plato himself gave rise to some rather good myths of his own, nonetheless, he often talks about myth in a somewhat disparaging way, as though it's just a story that isn't true. But this inability to understand that there are certain kinds of truth that can only be expressed poetically or through drama or through a narrative, and although those are obviously not true in the sense that you can technically go and measure something. They have a kind of much higher truth that the kind of truth that can be demonstrated by science wouldn't be able to reach.
Yeah, we're back to truth and reality, and then conflating reality with that which can be measured. It sounds
Yes,
rather simple,
yes.
but it's relatively recent. It's maybe 100 years old. This obsession that only what can be measured is real. Therefore, the only way to pursue truth is through instrumentation, scientific instrumentation.
Absolutely.
Mm.
It reminds me of Alistair McIntyre's remark that facts like telescopes and wigs for gentlemen were invented in the 17th century. What he's getting at is he's not denying that there are certain things that we can call, generally speaking, true, but the idea that there is something decontextualized that is forever the case was a new step. People had certainly always believed that certain things are false and certain things are not, but it's how to reach those ideas. And what is not understood fully, I think, by a lot of people, is that we can only understand things in terms of a metaphor or a model. Without a metaphor or a model for understanding them, without something we can liken them to and say, oh, I see, it's like that, we wouldn't be able to talk about truth at all.
Mm. Yes, in that sense, the work of Jimena Canales, historian of science, I also recommend reading, because she's looked at the history of measurement. He has this book, A Tenth of a Second. She also brought back the clash between Einstein and Bergson, and she speaks
That's
about
it.
what clocks, especially what choosing clocks as an image did to our understanding of, well, of course, time, but also reality and
Yes.
measurement. Again, back to the history of ideas. Go back to the
Yes.
history of ideas to understand where we are.
Yes, yes. And the idea of clock measurement of time is one that's been touched on by many people, by Jimenez, as you say, but also before by Gabriel Marcel and others. And you know, the way in which we measure these things, or things as we think of them, changes the way we think about them. We can think of them as divided up, whereas one of the biggest failings of our modern world picture, something we'll talk about when we come to talk about time specifically, is the idea of it being composed of pieces, and that this is at the root of many inabilities to understand what we're dealing with.
Actually, many paradoxes, which leads us to the next chapter, the next time we talk, right? Like, because this has to do with Zeno's paradoxes as well, chopping of time
Yeah,
and being able to make sense when we put it back together. How could
yes.
we wrap up, Ian? Maybe I ask you, having gone through this progeny, where are we now? We're kind of halfway part of part two of your book. Could we say something to conclude that reminds us where we are in this second half or second part, I should say, of the book?
Yes, the chapter we've been just discussing, chapter 15, is the second of three chapters about reason. And in the first one, of course, I talked about its strengths and its inherent limitations. In this one, I've talked about these pairs of things that, when we engage in reason, we're asked to balance. And the next chapter we'll be talking about specifically paradox, where I think that the left hemisphere cast of mind that's become so prevalent leads to the perception of conflicts that we call paradox. What I'm hoping to show here in this whole section of the book, part 2, is the value of the four ways in which I think we can say we come to an understanding of reality, and at the same time some sense of their possible limits, just so that we're aware of those limits in using them. We can be wiser, we can be, as A.N. Whitehead said, more shrewd. So what I want to emphasize is that I'm not recommending abandoning anything here. I'm just recommending that we talk and think wisely about the methods whereby we aim to come to an understanding of the world and of ourselves. And one way of just finishing off what we've been talking about today, is to say that there is a realm of things which in fact now includes physics, which cannot be expressed in ordinary, everyday, prosaic language. Famously, Bohr and others have said that physics can only really be reached in a language which is that of poetry, and that is also true of science. And is, by that very fact, is more true about the complexities of the humanities. And a myth is therefore not something inferior, but something very rich and powerful. Perhaps I would just mention the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, because it's just so beautiful and it's also so potent. This is, I think, the greatest of all the Greek myths, and people will know it, but I'll just remind you that Orpheus was a demigod. His mother was a goddess of music, and his father was a Thracian prince. And he fell in love with a princess. After the wedding, Eurydice was walking in a meadow with her bridesmaids, and she was bitten by a viper and died. And Orpheus was absolutely devastated by her loss, and he decided that he was going to go into the underworld and see if he could plead for the return of his bride. And Orpheus was supposedly the greatest musician who ever lived. He was able to not just move human hearts, but to move stones, change the course of rivers. His music was as potent as anything. And he went to the underworld and played for the gods. And the gods' hearts were moved, and they relented. And they said, okay, Eurydice can go back to live with you. And he was overjoyed. But they said there is one condition, which is that you must not look back on your way leading her out of the underworld. And at the very moment when he saw the light and he knew that they were about to emerge into the real world, he could contain himself no longer, and he turned round and looked at Eurydice, and she melted away back into the underworld, and he lost her again forever this time. Why that is so interesting for me is that it's not only a great truth about life, but it's a truth about myth itself. That myth is a kind of knowledge that you can't look directly at, and when you do, you destroy it. It is this ability to accompany it, to love it, and not subject it to that focal stare of the left hemisphere, which will cause all its power and life to depart.
What a way to end. Thank you, Iain. That's potent indeed. Yeah, that's potent indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. That's great. And I suppose next time we meet, it'll be to talk about paradox, which I think will be quite a lot of fun, actually.
Yes, for sure. Until then.
Good.
Goodbye.
Okay. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Welcome.